Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, Tristen, it's been a couple weeks. How are things over in Hong Kong?
All is very well. Most excitingly, all of my worldly possessions showed up. The movers came in on the weekend. And so what you can't see off screen is just a sea of boxes and packing paper, and really me wishing that I could rid myself of my worldly possessions, because I don't know where all of this stuff is going to go. I mean, it's not like apartments in Britain are large, but moving to Hong Kong, boy,
Whole new ball game.
I'm gonna be taking the Marie Kondo approach to my life. I never imagined that would be me, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, we could all use a little bit of that as well.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm going to be sitting here staring at you speak with an anxious look on your face as you're just looking at all those boxes the entire time, thinking about all the unpacking you have to do. But yeah, things are good, really busy, but the Mud Hens have won 2 in a row. So we got a little win streak going right now, which is big.
That's a good turnaround.
Yeah. So, we're starting to come together right at the right time of the season. We're getting close to playoffs. So, so we'll see what happens. But no, the weather's been great, and it's starting to get into fall here in our nation's capital. But anyways, enough of the banter. What are we going to talk to the folks about today?
Well, once again, there's plenty happening
Always.
on the diplomacy front this week. We're going to start at the White House with President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu's September 29th announcement of a 20-point plan aimed at a Gaza ceasefire and hostage release. Then we'll turn to the Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on where we're listening to this, protests in Morocco and Madagascar, before shifting to Europe's attempt to crack down on Russia's so-called shadow fleet. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up with an interview on Moldova's recent elections with former U.S. Ambassador to Moldova, Kent Logsdon. So we begin with the meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the 29th of September. They appeared side by side to unveil a sweeping 20-point peace proposal aimed at ending the war in Gaza. Trump opened by declaring that they were, in his words, very, very close to a breakthrough. He thanked Netanyahu for his cooperation. He emphasized urgency. The proposal calls for an immediate ceasefire, suspension of military operations, and the release of all Israeli hostages, be they dead or alive, within 72 hours of Israel's formal acceptance. And we know that at least this has not quite happened time of recording, since Hamas has demanded some further negotiations that are presently ongoing. Now, Netanyahu has echoed his support for this plan. He's framed it as being consistent with his war aims, dismantling Hamas's military capabilities, ending its political control, and ensuring that Gaza never again pose a threat to Israel's security. So just to very briefly touch on some of the key features, as I mentioned, it calls for a ceasefire to allow for hostage exchange. It calls for an establishment of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee for the administration of Gaza, overseen by a new international so-called Board of Peace, with, perhaps unsurprisingly, President Trump as chair, and other key international figures, most notably Tony Blair, involved. Indeed, it calls for Hamas to disarm, relinquish its governing role, and commit to no longer rebuilding military infrastructure. Involves a large-scale prisoner exchange. It ensures humanitarian access, reconstruction aid, and it ensures no forced expulsion of Palestinians, and any who wish to leave may do so, and any who wish to return may likewise do so. Now, President Trump gave Hamas a deadline of last Sunday, that's October 5th, at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, to accept the plan or face consequences. At time of recording, now midweek, we're still in the midst of negotiations. So, with all of that said, with that preface, how do we interpret all this? How do we interpret Netanyahu's support for this? Do you think this is a genuine shift? Is this a political concession under U.S. pressure? I note that the plan doesn't actually differ much in substance from what was Biden and Blinken's plan a year ago. How should we read what we're observing now?
So, I mean, I think it's definitely more of a political concession at this point under pressure from President Trump. I don't think, I mean, Netanyahu's the longest serving prime minister of Israel for a reason, right? He knows how to survive, he knows how to remain in power, and he knows how to play those games. And as we've mentioned on this podcast multiple times, he has a personal stake in remaining prime minister because if he loses his seat, he will end up going on trial for corruption. So he's, beholden in many ways to this hard right wing cabinet that he has in power, who keep threatening to, dismantle the government and leave the government if Netanyahu doesn't go along with their extremely hardline views and policies towards Gaza and towards Hamas. So I do think, I don't see this as a genuine shift. I think he's going with the political winds right now and sees that he needs to do this to some extent. And we've seen that he's really selling this in Israel as his plan, something that he came up with, even though Trump has been on, multiple media outlets saying that it's his plan and that they gave it to him and that like he basically told Netanyahu, this is what you're going to do. So I think that's where we are. Now, that being the case, if it happens and if Netanyahu is able to sell this to the Israeli people, but more so his hardline cabinet, I mean, I think that's the biggest issue, right? I think the Israeli people are ready for this to end, are ready for the hostages to come back, and have been so for some time. And I think the biggest issue is going to be him trying to sell it to the hard right. And that's where a lot of these, you noted that the negotiations are ongoing, and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are on their way to Egypt as we speak to join in the negotiations between Israeli officials and Qatari officials and Hamas officials. And they keep talking about the technicalities that they need to negotiate. Well, that's where the money is, right? In these technicalities, like Hamas disarming is a technicality that they need to negotiate, right? And I mean, these are existential sticking points for both sides. But from Hamas's side, they see their ability to maintain arms as a lifeline, right? To continuing in some form or having some sort of power, not necessarily now, but maybe in the future. So things like that are going to be huge sticking points and are going to be the really tough things to negotiate. And, we'll see. There's good sides to this with, it's not calling for a Palestinian state, but it did say that there needs to be a credible pathway to Palestinian statehood. And Trump actually got Netanyahu to sign on to that clause. So that's not nothing, but these are things that need to be negotiated. And the Arab states in the region are backing this deal at the moment. But there's a lot of things to happen for this to actually be signed. And I know that President Trump is, all caps tweeting out and stuff on social media and Truth Social that this needs to happen fast and immediately. But, I wouldn't be surprised to see this, go past the weekend and into next week if at least, right? I mean, these things are not something that normally gets negotiated that quickly. But the interesting thing is what has become, at least to this point, now that no deal's signed and Israel hasn't backed away from like major demands yet, right? But like to this point seems like some form of capitulation from Netanyahu on this that demonstrates that he is more leery of President Trump doing something drastic in the Israel-US relationship than he was of President Biden doing something like that. So, so we'll see what happens. The fact that there is the Israelis are only, from what we understand, doing defensive operations right now and not going full on into Gaza City like they were about to. These are all good things, right? But you mentioned the access to humanitarian aid and infrastructure rebuilding and things like that. Something that gets, I think, forgotten in this because of the need for this war to stop, and people rightfully emphasizing that and focusing on that so much, is just the massive, massive undertaking that rebuilding Gaza is going to be when it does begin. I mean, it is just completely demolished, and that's going to be a huge road to hoe with getting funding and who's going to do that and trying to rebuild that, let alone the political infrastructure that they're also going to have to implement. We've talked multiple times also about the downsides to the Palestinian Authority, their corruption, the fact they're a gerontocracy in their leadership, and a lot of Palestinians don't necessarily see them as the pathway forward. So there's multiple avenues that still need to be hashed out on this. It's good that we're talking and they're negotiating, but still a lot to be done.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, no doubt in 2 weeks' time, we'll almost certainly have more more to discuss.
Yes, for sure. Hopefully, if no deal is signed, that means they're still talking and not that Israel has gone into Gaza City. So we will see. All right, moving on. Listeners will remember our interview from a couple weeks ago with a Nepali journalist, Pranaya Rana. And we wanted to touch on two related stories that cropped up since then. And these are related to those Gen Z protests that we were talking about in Nepal. So recently in Morocco, the Gen Z 212 protests began in late September. And these are loosely organized via TikTok, Discord, Instagram, social media accounts without really any kind of formal leadership structure. So, what ignited these protests was a horrible tragedy where 8 women died while giving birth at a public hospital in Agadir, reportedly from complications tied to poor medical care. This incident has become a rallying cry and crystallized broader frustration with the health system in general. And from that flashpoint, protests spread rapidly. And by October 1st, just last week, the conflict has escalated. Security forces fired on demonstrators during clashes, leading to at least 3 deaths and over 400 arrests. And that's not the only Gen Z protest going on. There's also one happening in Madagascar, where there protests erupted over prolonged water and electricity outages that have interrupted schools, hospitals, businesses, and just like everything, right? The protests began about 3 weeks ago when two city council members in the capital were arrested for planning a protest against water and electricity funding cuts. Tensions escalated rapidly after that, and the UN estimates at least 22 deaths and over 100 injured amidst the clashes. In response, the president, Andre Rajoelina, dissolved his government, a move that has not quelled the protests. The protesters are demanding dissolution of the Electoral Commission, the Constitutional Court, and deeper structural reforms to the government. Crucially, also, in interviews and commentary, the protesters explicitly cite Nepal's recent Gen Z uprising as an inspiration. And some of the same symbols that were used in Nepal have also appeared in Madagascar's marches. Nepal's case is often held up by other movements as proof that youth mobilization can force rapid political change, even in relatively authoritarian states. So, Tristen, given what's happening now in these two new states, can we tie this to the Nepal example? Is this a broader Gen Z movement that is fed up with poor governance and corruption?
Well, the parallels are certainly striking. We have young people in disparate contexts converging around similar demands over healthcare, over education, political accountability, and centrally using digital platforms to mobilize without sort of a clear hierarchy amongst them. And exactly as you point out, the symbolic, the aesthetic dimensions are also notably not just similar, but the same. Most notably, I think, is the pirate flag from One Piece, which is a Japanese manga series. For those who are unaware, I've only recently been introduced to One Piece, but they've become transnational motifs and evoke narratives. It's a pirate flag of
Right.
rebellion and a challenge to authority. Now, the Institute of Economics and Peace, which is an Australian-based NGO, has done some really good analysis on this, and they've tied these protest movements together, and they make the argument that they are here to stay and that they're likely to proliferate. As a new generation of digital natives becomes politically aware and politically engaged, it really shouldn't be too surprising that they have their particular form for doing things. And the digital nature of the organizing of these protests means that these movements don't necessarily need a structured hierarchy, and it can also go a long way to help us explain why the flashpoints that trigger these protests can really catch fire so quickly. Like you mentioned in Morocco. Now, I don't want to sort of overegg the novelty of this. I I'm struck by the similarities, particularly with the Occupy movement. Also non-hierarchical. Social media also played a central role, and of course, the use of pop cultural artifacts in the symbolism of it all. With Occupy, it was the Guy Fawkes mask from V for Vendetta, and then also, like, let's not forget the centrality of social media in the Arab Spring, right? And the speed of organization in response to flashpoint um, moments. So there's much that's new. There's certainly much to be analyzed here, but let's not overegg sort of this as a rupture from the past. Now, to make everyone feel a little old, the eldest members of Gen Z or Z are now just under 30, about 28. So we have a full decade cohort of this generation who are adults. And so, again, it makes sense that we're seeing how they organize and mobilize politically. And we should be thinking about the ways that governments respond and need to respond to this. We heard from Pranaya last week that when Nepal blacked out social media, uh, that escalated things quickly and massively. And certainly other governments will be taking note. That uh, having a heavy hand and just putting a blackout on social media apps, be it Discord, be it WhatsApp, this might actually not be an effective tool to stop unrest. Now, of course, outcomes will vary. Let's remember Nepal's institutions were unusually brittle. The PM's hold was already shaky, and the protests erupted in Kathmandu's political heart. Now, in Morocco, the state has more capacity, has more legitimacy, and the ruling monarchy still carries a symbolic authority. And in Madagascar, the scale of underdevelopment, institutional weakness, and security capacity could mean more serious consequences if order breaks down without clear next steps. So, moreover, state responses matter. The moment protests turn violent or even are just portrayed as such, governments can come in with a heavy hand and justify crackdowns. But because, exactly as we've both highlighted, these are decentralized movements. This is a tricky problem for governments, right? Who do you negotiate with? Um, what what is a resolution to the protests if there's no uh, central, sort of authority or leader with whom to negotiate? So, Nepal shows what's possible, but it's not necessarily a blueprint. It's a hint. Morocco and Madagascar are now testing the grounds for whether this particular form of protest can cross from at a minimum symbolic disruption into durable political influence.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, you bring up the similarities to the Arab Spring, which I immediately latch on to, having been a Middle Eastern intel analyst during that whole era. And the similarities are there. And I mean, obviously, these things aren't exactly the same, but it's a lot of youth out in the street, set off by a street cart vendor self-immolating due to the corruption in government in Tunisia, sets off a wave of people saying, you know what, we've got it bad because of corruption and bad economics and a lack of really any future here because of lack of jobs and poor infrastructure and all this stuff. So it has striking similarities. They were many of them were sort of not hierarchical and just mass people with really no oppositional leader
Mm.
necessarily to negotiate with. So it does, strike me a lot of the similarities there. Hopefully these turn out better than most of the Arab Spring uprisings did, but we'll see. And there's a certain point when people are faced with hardships that don't have to happen if there's better governance and better anti-corruption policies in place and things like that, where, they've had enough. And that's, I think, what we're seeing happen in these new places.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be able to so easily, readily see what is happening elsewhere in the world and draw inspiration from it, like that's, that is in the broad sweep of history. That's new. And that's really, really interesting. And that accelerates the rate at which these sorts of movements can happen, can erupt, can galvanize and mobilize.
Right. I mean, think about, the Arab Spring and how much we talked about social media being used there. That was 2011. And well, 2010 was when it really first started in the end of 2010, but into early 2011. And think about the proliferation of social media now and smartphones even more so than they were back then, and it's just exponentially larger, and its reach can go so much further, like you say. So, yeah, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. Moving on, and we've touched on this in past episodes, but we wanted to talk a little bit more about Russia's shadow fleets in this episode. And this ties, to Russia, to its war in Ukraine, and ongoing international efforts to isolate Russia's war economy. So, ever since Western sanctions have made it harder for Russia to export its oil and gas, which are, as we know, Russia's main sources of revenue. Russia has massively proliferated its so called shadow fleet of tankers that transport this oil and gas to other places for sale. So, some of our listeners may remember that G7 and Western countries imposed a price cap on Russian oil and gas near the start of the war. And part of the reason for the shadow fleet is to circumvent that price gap by labeling the oil or gas as not coming from Russia, hence the term shadow fleet. But it's also, we're talking about pirates in this episode. Now we're talking about shadow fleets. I see a through line. So, first off, many of these tankers go dark. And what I mean by that is that they switch off their ship's electronic identifiers so that they cannot be tracked, or at least it becomes much more difficult to track them, or they give and like broadcast false coordinates. So, second, they play flag hopping, which means that they frequently change out the national flag they sail under to dodge scrutiny. And lastly, they do ship to ship transfers in international waters. So, what I mean by that is that two big tankers will meet, oil moves from one to the other, and by the time it pulls into port, the paperwork can say something fuzzier than just saying Russian crude or where it came from and things like that. So, it's not just sanctions violations either. These shadow ships are badly regulated and maintained with poor insurance. So, a crash or accident involving these oil tankers would pose a serious environmental risk for European countries. And some of these have been tied to some of the damage that's been done to undersea cables that we talked about on an episode a while back. But analysis on this is still pretty murky, but estimates suggest that Russia's fleet has tripled to over 1,000 tankers since the start of the war. And remember, it makes sense because this is their main economic lifeline. The oil and gas that they need to sell to fund their war machine. So with the shadow fleets, there's so many different things at play here with sanctions and evading sanctions. Some partners and things are buying oil from these shadow fleets. What does it mean for Europe and for the war in Ukraine in more general terms, and what Russia's continuing ability to fund its war?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you say, there is so much here, and there are so many different strands to untangle. We have the sanctions angle and the environmental concerns that are increasing sharply as we have so many more of these unregulated ships floating around European waters, and you know, this is certainly crashing into the broader issue of potential NATO Russia escalation. Uh, you know, I imagine listeners will have seen the incursions that Russia has increasingly been making into NATO airspace, but many of these incursions are actually tied to these shadow tankers. So in May, Estonia attempted to detain a ship, the Jaguar, a sanctioned vessel that flew no country flag. The Russian Air Force scrambled fighter jets to protect the ship, and Estonian forces backed down. Now, France, for its part, boarded one tanker, the Boracay, a few days ago after it passed Denmark during a week of disruptive drone sightings. The captain was charged for failing to obey naval orders and not providing the ship's nationality. Now, Moscow blasted the action as piracy,
As they would.
as they would, but also then, of course, claimed no connection to the vessel. And Russia has vowed a response to these efforts, as the defender of the free seas, and particularly on Europe's eastern flank, where many NATO members share the Baltic Sea with Russia. And I think it's almost certain that we are likely to see more and more of these standoffs and incursions into European airspace. And again, thinking of something that we've covered on this podcast before, we've got the undersea cable issue as well, something that is a serious concern. Shadow fleets that are untrackable open the door for the kind of sabotage that could inflict serious harm on Europe if Russia quite literally cuts the internet cables. And then zooming out further, you could also see this positively on the sanctions issue. If Russia has to risk violent escalation in order to protect some of its oil and gas assets that are headed to China, that are headed to India, it might suggest that Western sanctions are starting to bite, and that the Russian economy might be getting into serious trouble because they're having to defend this so ardently.
Yeah, I know you mentioned the India angle, and I think that's something that's really important to all of this, and we've discussed this on the podcast already a few weeks ago, but in 2021, and I think we mentioned this last time as well, just around 3% of India's oil imports came from Russia. That number's now around like 50%, which is a staggering increase in not only in just such a short space of time, but when you also think of the fact that there's sanctions on these on Russian oil and gas. So, the bulk of this oil and gas is transported via these shadow fleets, with all kinds of webs of intermediaries, and this actually allows Russia to charge higher than the price cap. So they're gonna be able to get past that and not only sell their oil and gas, but make more money on it than the price cap allows. And this explains partly why President Trump, and this is what we focused on in past episodes when we were talking about the India issue. This is why, in part, he smacked the massive new tariffs on India. But also, I think for the broader strategic picture for NATO, this certainly isn't welcome, right? As you mentioned, Putin is comfortable with probing NATO airspace with, we've seen fighter jets, we've seen drones. And, he's no doubt testing the resolve of the alliance. And, I don't think none of us really expect President Trump to mobilize American forces because Estonia's airport is closed for 2 hours. But, where does this end? I think that's the bigger question here is how far does he push? Where is that red line?
Mm.
Putin is classic Putin playbook of poke and probe more and more and more and see how far you can go to the point where, NATO isn't really sure where its red lines are, where it's going to step in and do something. And the whole time you're sort of undermining Article 5 of the collective defense. And even more broadly, I think this proliferation of these shadow fleets also just undermines international shipping in a very negative way. And there's, multiple complicated webs of conventions and laws that try to make international shipping, safe, make it transparent. But with more and more of these kinds of ships out there, there's, just less knowledge about where ships are, what goods they contain, where they're going, who owns them. And that's not a good thing for international shipping. And, it increases insurance costs, which makes the cost of the goods more expensive. And, this is a space that was previously largely reserved for countries like Iran and North Korea. Now Russia's getting into this, which also means that we've got a very large state power and a whole lot of more money being put into this business. And, this does have a big impact on all of us. Like I said, the insurance prices, issues of regulation and compliance and customs, if all of this becomes more expensive, it is going to raise the cost of like everything we buy, right? But especially energy and other consumer goods. And it's just one more way that over the course of going on almost 4 years now,
Yeah.
the war in Ukraine is seriously threatening the international order and finances and economy writ large and all these different things. And this is going to keep going on, and it's going to keep increasing pressure, I think, on European countries in the U.S. to try to stop this and hold the line at some point. But where that line is, I think, remains to be seen.
Yeah, and it's crazy to be saying that, 4 years into this.
Yeah, I know. I had to do the math, and I was like, wait a minute, is that right?
Yeah.
But yeah, insane. But all right. Well, that ends our news roundup. And we're now going to move to my conversation on Moldovan elections with Ambassador Kent D. Logsdon. Ambassador Logsdon, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, he most recently served as the United States Ambassador to the Republic of Moldova from 2021 to 2024. He was also the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, Germany, serving as Chargé from January 2017 to May 2018. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Headlines and History. And I'm excited today to be joined by former U.S. Ambassador to Moldova, Kent Logsdon. And Kent is going to break down the recent elections in Moldova for us. Kent, thanks for joining us. Happy to have you.
Thanks, Kelly. It's great to be here.
So before we dive in, I mean, I know, European elections are always important, but seem to be even more important these days with the continuance and the rising of right-wing parties in Europe, and the Russians always seem to get involved one way or the other in things. So before we get into that, though, can you give us a little bit of the big picture here? So Moldova just held parliamentary elections on September 28th. Can you tell us who were the main parties contending and what were the results? What happened in the election?
Sure. It was a really pivotal election for the Republic of Moldova. And as you know, it's a parliamentary democracy. So you've got a president, Maya Sandu, who was reelected last year in a very close race with a lot of Russian attention and support for her opponent. Maya Sandu's party, the Political Action Solidarity Party, or PAS, as they call themselves, they really do run the parliament. She is not officially the head of the PAS party, That said, she is the founder and the leader of the country and leader of that party. So it's really important for her agenda, to have at least either a majority or a working coalition in parliament. So that's why these elections were so pivotal. She has now got 4 more years in office. This is an election for parliament for 4 more years. The key way to look at it, it's actually pretty easy. You can look at it as kind of the past support for Maya Sandu and support for a European vector or European path moving toward the EU and EU membership, versus a pro-Russian set of parties and groups of parties that came together to offer an alternative with much more of a return to the past. So that's really what, if you kind of look at it in broad terms. It turned out the results, and it's 101 seats in the parliament. And for the last 4 years, PAS has had an absolute majority. And there was great skepticism that they could do kind of a repeat, that they could get this full majority on their own. In fact, they did better than 4 years ago. They actually had more votes by vote for the parliamentary seats, and they ended up with 55 seats in the 101 seat parliament. An absolute majority that they're able to use. It's not a constitutional majority, but it's slightly better than they had before. And that's critical for the president and for PAS's political aspirations, which is really to continue moving Moldova away from the Russian orbit, the old Soviet Union, and move them closer to Europe and to eventual EU membership. The main opposition party, which was led by former President Igor Dodon, socialists and communists, former socialists and former communists, I should say, though they also call themselves communists there. It's a grouping. They only got about 24% of the vote, which will translate into 26 seats. So they will be the main opposition. They were the main opposition in the last parliament. There was an alternative party, which really was an alternative to PAS. It was it is led by the mayor of Chisinau, who has been a supporter, so at least publicly says he's a supporter of EU integration, but he ended up in a coalition with a number of groups that actually made his message a little less clear. There were some folks who were absolutely not supporting the European vector. There's an older politician who's been around a long time, Renato Asati. Usati's party, Our Party, ended up with about 6% of the vote. They will get 6 seats in parliament. And then there's a PPDA, or Democracy at Home Party, which kind of came from nowhere. It had a lot of Russian support. There's actually a complaint lodged by the government that the CEC and actually the Constitutional Court is now looking at. They ended up with a little over 5%, which got them into the parliament over the threshold with another 6 seats. So that's the total breakdown of 101. So PAS has a very comfortable majority going forward, which is good for the president, good for the European vector of the country, and I'd say good for U.S. policy as well, because we'd like to see Moldova continue that move westward. The diaspora, as always, played a very important role. They were not quite as strongly supportive of the president's role, but many Moldovans live outside of the country. So the PAS party ended up with about 78% of the votes from the diaspora. So that's a huge amount that really helped push them over the top. But this time they did so well inside the country that they actually could get the majority on their own.
So, from a policy standpoint, what does this majority actually let the past government do? What are they going to be pushing forward? And, you mentioned they do have that majority with 55 seats, but there's a lot of other parties that were mostly in the opposition that have, a handful here, a handful there. Is there any means by which these other opposition parties or Russia-backed parties can stymie what they want to do, or are they pretty much in the clear having the 55 seats?
Well, politics, Kelly. There's always ability to stymie progress. And of course, I fully expect these parties to take actions over the next months and years to try to slow down or to thwart some of the past objectives. They will certainly think about street action. They've done it in the past at different times, especially if there are economic issues, and we can talk about that again in a little while. They may also be able to lodge some court cases. PAS has also been more active on the court side, just as in our own country. There's a lot of litigation out there. That could also be something that could derail the PAS objectives of moving closer to Europe. And then they have an interesting situation with the former strongman, if you will, of Moldova, Mr. Plahotniuc. was actually extradited from Greece pursuant to a Moldovan arrest warrant for fraud that he's alleged to have committed while he was kind of running the country before Maya Sandu took office. I think the Moldovans had no choice but to accept him. He's in prison in Moldova. He just had his appeal heard and was just turned down by the court to get out of jail. But he has still a fair amount of support by some in the country. He's got quite a network of economic interests and pressure. So they've got to figure out what they're going to do with the Plahatnuk factor as that goes forward, as the court case unfolds, since he is back in the country.
So, from an issue standpoint, turning to the domestic side of things, what were the big driving issues in voters' minds when they went to the polls on the 28th?
Well, like everywhere, the economy, it's critical. It really, when I got to Moldova in 2022, I was struck by the depth of ties with Ukraine. Ukrainian products that I recognized from my posting in Ukraine were in all of the stores. There was a lot of back and forth of Ukrainian trade. And of course, that was really cut off once the war began in 2022. And there was never a shortage of goods, but they all had to come from the EU. They came from Romania, they came from Poland, and obviously more expensive. So that's one of the things that Moldovans have really struggled with. Inflation rates, it was only 4% last year. It was hovering around 8% this year. As you remember, a few years ago in the U.S., when we got anywhere close to that, people freaked out. And again, when the war started, they were closer to 13-14%. But the government did have to contend with that because people are feeling that inflation pressure. The jobs issue, the economy with Ukraine, the war continuing right next door, it's been hard to get more investment and get people to invest in Moldova, which would create jobs. And then they really struggle, frankly, with demography. They have had a demographic struggle to keep Moldovans in the country. Many smart young Moldovans go to university in Bucharest or elsewhere in Romania. They are Romanian speaking. They have a lot of opportunities in the EU. And how do you get them to come home? They have the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, which is a great benefit to Moldova in many ways. But it also means that people can go and work and live in the EU. And then how do you keep those people back home? So this is a country that at the end of the Soviet Union had about 4 million people. There's about 2.5 million live in Moldova itself right now. So it makes that clear why the diaspora vote is so important, but it's also a challenge, and that could derail some of the efforts if they can't keep the economy on track. Energy is another angle. They are going to have to continue to buy that energy on the open market. The Russian, they're 100% focused or dependent on Russia at the beginning of the war. And I was really pleased when I was in Moldova a few weeks ago. The U.S. government just announced that they are going forward with one of the big energy programs that we had worked on when I was there, which is building one of the lines, a new line that will bring electricity from the EU and from Romania and the grid to Moldova. So that will be a huge help on energy security for Moldova.
Yeah, that's being 100% dependent on Russia for anything, but especially oil, is not a good thing for any country.
Oil and gas in particular.
Yeah. So turning to foreign policy more specifically, and you mentioned the desire to join the EU. So there's a lot going on with that because of the war in Ukraine next door, the Russian interference, and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What this election means for the country's foreign policy outlook moving forward, and where does Moldova stand in its EU ascendancy at this point?
Yeah, those are great questions. The foreign policy issues are really out there. I heard a number of Moldovans express this to me when I was visiting in the way of, Ukraine is fighting back from the push that Russia is making to dominate and to control Ukraine. Moldova is fighting back too. They're fighting back via the ballot box. And that's why this election was so important, to show very clearly that they didn't want to go back, that the majority of people in Moldova were committed to this EU path. And we can talk about the complications of the Transnistrian separatist territory and how that might affect the long-term prospect. But there's a lot of work to be done, and this has given the government new impetus to push ahead, I think, and to continue working on all those chapters. As we know, I used to have a great relationship with my EU ambassador colleague, and he would always scowl a bit at me because that it's easy for you to say we support the Moldovans joining the EU. I have to do there and tell you what they have to do in order to get there, and it's a lot of work. But the Moldovans have really, really committed to this. They have put government resources. They've got an outstanding minister who's been leading this effort. And I think that's going to continue. The Russians don't want to see that. The Russians are going to continue to find ways, especially using mis and disinformation, that will try to turn people away. And the government has some pockets of real areas within Moldova they got to work on. They did better in Transnistria this time, actually, in the vote. Something like 25% of people from Transnistria, they're able to vote in the elections, and they voted 25% for pass. That's an increase. But if you look at Taraklia, for example, the Bulgarian-speaking part, which really gets all of its news from Russia and Russian sources, they got about 6% of the vote. So they've got some pockets they really do have to work on. But the Russians aren't. It's easy for them not to give up on Moldova. They can do this quite cheaply. Via dis and misinformation, they can continue to support these political forces with money and with other kinds of support or even street action. We know that anything is possible. So that's going to continue. And of course, the war in Ukraine, which will continue to be a threat to Moldova and to Moldova's future, because they really need those trading relationships, the border. Moldova has the longest border with Ukraine of any single country. And it is, of course, closed. It's been closed officially across the Transnistria sector, the disputed territory. And of course, with people, still 100,000 or so Ukrainians living in Moldova, they have some challenges that will really be difficult for this government that they'll have to continue to work on.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Russian misinformation, disinformation. Um, you were just there on the ground ahead of the elections. What were you seeing, and what role and effect do you think that played in the election? I mean, obviously, Pass still won, but not for a lack of effort on the part of the Russian.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And they won, I think, partly because they took very strong action. And President Sandu talked about this in some of her comments and statements after the election and in the run-up to the election. The Prosecutor General's office was very active. They ended up throwing out, removing a party the day before, 2 days before the election, the Heart of Moldova, led by a former governor of the Gagauzia area within Moldova. That was directly supported by Russia very openly, and there were election fraud violations, election campaign violations that the government decided, the CEC decided, Central Election Commission, I should say, decided that they could not participate in the elections. But there were a lot of efforts made by the government with great support, I think, from the work that we have done over the years. The Europeans and others have supported this to highlight those folks who, unfortunately, Moldova is still a poor country. And so people could have their votes purchased for, 50 euros, 100 euros. That means a lot to a family in the countryside. But the government was extremely vigilant in trying to highlight and trying to show those people, if they were caught, they had to take action, trying to take action for any time they found fraud or any kind of abuse on the election cycle. So I think that was a real difference. They were quite active and upfront, and people knew that the government and the law enforcement was out there trying to make sure that this was a free and fair election, that votes could not be purchased. The disinformation, the misinformation, that's easy. I remember the president telling me a few years ago, she said, it's so simple. It's all in Russian. People speak Russian in Moldovan. In Moldova, you can easily try things out here. You can try, 100 things against the wall. And if one or two of them take, well, that's good for Russia, and they can also use it elsewhere. It's a great testing ground. You don't have to translate it into French or English or Japanese, whatever it is. You can use it just as it is. So I think that's going to continue. It's still a lab in some ways for Russia. Moldova is going to continue to have to push back. There is going to continue to be a push from Russia for mis and disinformation against this government and against their push to continue their efforts to join the European Union.
So we'll get you out of here on this last question. What things are you looking for in the next months or years that will demonstrate to you that Pass is moving forward its agenda?
I think what we got to look at is, of course, how they're doing on their EU membership efforts, how they are continuing to put government resources, which are scarce, and they've got to see if they continue to make progress. And we also need to see how the Europeans respond and react and continue their strong support. We saw at National Day in Moldova at the end of August. We saw Chancellor Merz and President Macron actually standing there in Moldova, showing their direct support. I think it's been really important for Moldovans to not feel alone with that war in Ukraine next door, that they know Europe is with them. So I think we have to watch that as well. That's going to be really important. I think we have to watch how they deal with Transnistria as they move forward. What kind of engagement will they have? The Russians have now cut off the gas to Transnistria as well. How are they going to work, and how's that going to work this winter? How is the folks in Chisinau, the government, how are they going to take care of people in Transnistria and show them without somehow, taking away their principles of this territory is Moldova? How are they going to work on that? So those are things I think we're going to have to watch as the time goes forward. The other, of course, is the strength of the the government, the parliamentary faction. In the past, Moldova has struggled with defections. People can leave, people can turn around. That we did have two members of the 55 seats have already said they're going to be independent. They came from two of the smaller parties who joined in on the past list. They say they'll vote with the government, but if you see other movements like that, that would be a stress and a strain for this governing government to make progress on EU. So those are the things we're going to look at. Obviously, the biggest, one in the room is Ukraine. What happens in the long term with Ukraine? What kind of settlement can we see in Ukraine, and then what will the effect be on Moldova, and how that settlement might affect the future of the Transnistrian region. That Moldova, as we've all supported for many years, as a sovereign territory, all of Moldova. So we'll have to see how that all comes out.
All right, Ambassador Logsdon, thanks so much for joining us.
It was great. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this subject. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
again, it was an exciting result. I think it's really a credit to the people of Moldova that they made this choice really clear, that Europe is their future. They are Europeans, and that's their goal, is to continue on. So they've got 4 years ahead of them of very hard work. But I've been very impressed, and I'm pretty confident that Moldovans can do this. They can get there.
All right, thanks again.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks again to Ambassador Logsdon for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdullah Nassif. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GeoDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.